my name's Malika Saada Sar, and I am Google's Senior Counsel on Civil and Human Rights. And so we're going to spend this part of the day talking about criminal justice reform, okay? So let me give you some background here. We have really been in a period of mass incarceration, of super predator narratives, of the over-criminalization of our communities, especially our Black and brown communities. You know, before I came to Google, I spent over 15 years doing human rights law. And much of that time, I was fighting for women and girls behind bars. And I remain haunted by the images of children who would come to the prison to be able to see their mothers, but were not allowed to touch their mothers during their visits. I remain haunted by mothers who shared with me that they were shackled by their ankles across their bellies during labor and childbirth. And I will hold with me forever the faces and the voices of the girls I met behind bars. 14, 15-year-old girls who were just girls. Girls who were frightened, alone, and traumatized. But right now, I stand here with you having a lot of hope, because we are at a moment in criminal justice reform where we have Democrats and Republicans fighting for reform. We have Democrats and Republicans interrogating the very practices and policies that produced mass incarceration. And so that's what we're going to talk about. And to help lead us in that conversation, we are honored to have Ms. Alice Johnson. Yes. Ms. Alice was sentenced to life for a first-time nonviolent felony. After serving almost 22 years, she was granted clemency by the president. And we will also be joined by Mark Holden, who is Senior Vice President and General Counsel for Koch Industries. But before we have that conversation, it is my absolute honor and privilege to introduce to you someone who has really been not just a leader, but an alchemist in the push for prosecutorial reform. It is my honor to introduce Kim Foxx.
Good afternoon. How many people know what a prosecutor is in this room? I'm impressed. I usually start with how many people have watched Law & Order in this room? And in the beginning, we all know that there's a crime that needs to be solved, and we spend the first half an hour talking about whodunit. And the next half an hour, you see the prosecution team working together, diligently trying to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In the Law & Order scenario, I am Jack McCoy. Better looking, more funny, but Jack McCoy no less. I am the top prosecutor for Cook County, Illinois, which is the city of Chicago and its 130 surrounding suburbs. I oversee the second largest prosecutor's office in the country. We have about 800 lawyers who work for us, 300 administrative staff, and 100 investigators. In 2017, we saw 40,000 felony cases and 250,000 misdemeanor cases come through our criminal justice system. And with those attorneys and with those cases, there are human stories behind each and every one. And as proud as I am to work at the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, as proud as I am to lead that organization, I am part of a justice system that is fundamentally broken. It's not flawed. It doesn't need tweaking. It is fundamentally broken. Malika talked about the young women that she's seen in her journeys in human rights. I want to tell you a story about a young girl. And it's important because when we talk about young people in our criminal justice system, particularly young girls in our justice system, over 2/3 of them have had some form of trauma in their early childhood. I'm going to tell you about a young girl who grew up in a single-parent household. She was the second child of a teenage mother who was born and raised in one of the toughest public housing complexes in the country. Back in the 70s and 80s, Cabrini Green was the toughest public housing complex in the country. Her father had gone off to school. Her mother raised her brother and the young girl by herself at the age of 18. This young girl was sexually assaulted between the ages of 5 and 7, was brutally assaulted at the age of 7 by 2 strangers. Her mother, who had struggled for years with mental health issues, particularly depression and bipolar, who used marijuana on a regular basis to calm the voices in her head. A mother who was struggling in an economy as a high school dropout in a city that was stratified by those who had and those who had not. She continued to be a have-not. Despite that, she moved her family out of Cabrini so that they can get an education a mile north in a neighborhood called Lincoln Park. And there, the girl and the brother got the access to one of the best educations that the city could offer. And despite the fact that they didn't belong there, they bounced from apartment to apartment from the course of her 3rd grade until she graduated from high school. And in her junior year of high school, found herself homeless with her mother for 6 months. Despite all of that, she was able to complete her education and move on with her life. The sad reality is that we see this profile of this young girl replicated in our criminal justice system over and over and over again. There's almost an inevitability that that description that I gave you of that young girl, an inevitability that she will end up in our criminal justice system. The thing is, I did end up in the criminal justice system as the first African-American woman to lead the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. I tell you that to set the tone for the work that I do every day, that I see young Kim Foxxes throughout our criminal justice system on any given day. Every day, as I said, I preside over a justice system that sees in Chicago 86% of the people who come through are Black or brown. The overwhelming majority of the young people or the older people who come through live below our poverty line. Most of them come from areas of concentrated poverty. As I said, I grew up in Cabrini Green. For those of you who may not know what that is, if you watch old episodes of Good Times, the exterior shot is where Cabrini was. And it was poverty stacked on top of one another. And when I tell people the story about my own sexual trauma, about growing up in a single-parent household, about a mother who struggled with mental health and drug addiction, people ask me all the time, how did you make it? How did you do it? And I say to them, the mere asking of the question is based on the supposition that I was supposed to fail. I have beat the odds. I have somehow made it through all of these barriers. And people want to know, what is the secret sauce to that? And what I challenge to all of you here today is, how have we become so acceptable of failed systems that have people ending up in our criminal justice system that we celebrate the 1 or 2 that get out? Our criminal justice system is made up of many, many me's. My brother is someone who was also in the same circumstances that I lived through, who had the opportunity, after having dropped out of high school, gone back to get his GED, to study theater at Juilliard. I have a cousin who spent 7 years in prison for having sold drugs. I have another cousin who was shot 8 times and had to move from Cabrini to a neighborhood called Inglewood years later for his safety and his family's safety. These stories, my personal stories, again, are echoed every day. And so the work that I do in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office is not based on the premise that we're doing it right, we're doing it wrong. How many people who live in my city, in my county, have we lost to the streets as it relates to violence or over-incarceration? When I heard Michael Tubbs talking this morning, I was in my seat elated because he is the personification and demonstration of what's possible in every neighborhood in the city of Chicago or Stockton. And yet, we throw away the potential Michael Stocktons every day to a criminal justice system that has criminalized poverty, in some case blackness, in the quest for what we call personal safety. When we talk about what does it mean to be safe, we have imagined only a scenario in which jails and incarceration is the answer. Now, I will address the elephant in the room. I do come from Chicago, which does have a high issue as it relates to violence, particularly gun violence. In 2016, we lost almost 760 people to gun violence. That is absurd. Overwhelmingly, they were black and brown boys. As the murder rate has gone down over the course of the last 2 years, it's still unacceptably high. And so when I talk about criminal justice reform, people ask me all the time, how can you talk about reform in a system that is badly broken while grappling with the issues of violence? Because they're inextricably linked. That when we talk about the issue of criminal justice reform, I don't just start with the issues at the jailhouse. We know what's happening in our neighborhoods. We know what the ineffective educations that young people, particularly young people of color in Cook County, leads to. We know that a young person who is suspended from school in 3rd grade, 4th grade, that their likelihood of entering the criminal justice system is high. We know for families who are dealing with poverty in our neighborhoods and we're suffering with issues that lead them to our child welfare system, that children in foster care are overwhelmingly represented in our juvenile delinquency system. And that children in our juvenile delinquency system have a 10 times more likelihood of entering our adult criminal justice system. So what can we do? What is possible? First, we have to talk about criminal justice not as a charitable exercise, that we don't see the beauty of an Alice Johnson and say, we want to support just Alice. Alice is here today because she's fighting for those women who she left behind. That we can't get excited about the hashtag about freeing Meek Mill and forget that Meek is fighting for the people that he left behind. Behind the celebrity of criminal justice reform and the movies that have been made and the hashtags that we find, every day there are hundreds of thousands of people who are battling with things that if we knew better, we certainly would do better. So one of the things that we've been tackling is around bail reform. Most people, if you watch enough Law and Order or these TV shows, know that that first moment is when they determine whether someone is going to get bail or go home. And the way our system is set up, bail was supposed to be offered to make sure that someone who is a flight risk, that they're going to not return to court, or that they're a danger to society, that we wanted to put parameters in place to make sure you don't leave or you don't hurt anyone. But what's happened is the perversion of our bail system around the ability to pay cash bail has meant that for thousands of people across this country, they sit in jail cells not because they're a threat, but because they are poor. That has also meant that we have an overpopulation of people who are in our jails because they are there, not simply just because they're poor, they're picked up for offenses that you and I know are public health issues. We have an overwhelming number of people who have been incarcerated because of drugs. The war on drugs was a failed experiment. And I think we would have universal agreement about that. But if I were to tell you that every day on the city of Chicago streets, people are being arrested for possessing drugs, that every day that we talk about our concern about the opioid crisis, that instead of investing in drug treatment services and facilities, we invest in more sheriff's deputies to lock them up. That when we talk about bail and drugs, we also talk about the issue of mental health. It's why I lead with the story of my mother, who, despite the issues that she was suffering with mental health, parented me very well, even while she smoked marijuana every day. And yet, Cook County houses the largest single-site jail in the country. And by estimates, about two-thirds, 2 out of 3 of the people who are there are suffering from some mental health issue. What we find for those people who are suffering from mental health issues is that many of them have that coupled with drug addiction issues. What we then find is that many of these people who are suffering with drug addiction and mental health issues do things and act in ways to support those issues. We know this. And yet, when I have conversations about justice reform, or yet when I talk about these issues, people ask me, what more do we need to do at the jails, and not at the beginning of the continuum? Where do we need to make our investments? When we talk about bail, I often tell the story of a man who was arrested for having stolen $11 worth of Irish Spring soap. $11. And I had instituted a new bail policy where we were not going to have people in our jail because of their inability to pay $1,000 or less. And I was able to do that because if your bail was just $1,000, it was a real indicator that you weren't there for a serious offense. But there was this man who, despite the new bail policy, had come back and forth for having stolen $11 worth of Irish Spring. And I asked, why did we have him in bail? He was put on a no bond status. They said, well, he had violated his bail 6 times before. And I said, did it dawn on anybody that perhaps this man is homeless? And the ability for him to get to and from the courthouse is not the same as someone who has money. And they said, oh, we know he's homeless. But he didn't come back. He didn't follow the rules. That is how our criminal justice system is operating right now. That it didn't matter that he couldn't come back on his own volition. What mattered was he had broken the rules. It doesn't matter that someone is struggling with a drug addiction, and we know it's a public health crisis. We know, if you know anyone who's been addicted to drugs, the struggle that it is for them to get themselves off. We arrest them. It didn't matter that we know for the young girls who we find who are caught up in some of the worst abuses, like human trafficking, that we have a system that was treating them like offenders and not like victims. So for me, we took on the issues. We took on the issue of bail reform because it's not fair to criminalize people for being poor. Not in our name, not in the name of justice. It also meant that we took on issues related to wrongful convictions. In the city of Chicago, we had a terrible reputation across the world, quite frankly, for being the wrongful conviction capital, the false confession capital. What that meant was that we had, literally, a police sergeant who had passed away a couple weeks ago, who reigned terror over a neighborhood of African American and Latino men. So much so that the death penalty was abolished in Illinois about 15 years ago because it was determined that he had tortured confessions out of these men. And that as we right now grapple with police and community relations in the city of Chicago, for many people who live in neighborhoods that have been impacted by these types of policies, these types of practices of torture and coercion, of disrespect, that they don't want to cooperate with police or prosecutors. It means that the very neighborhoods that are struggling with violence are some of the very neighborhoods that would find that calling the police is the last thing that they wanted to do. And so we also found that there was behaviors that were allowed to happen in certain neighborhoods. For example, the Ida B. Wells housing project on the west side of the city of Chicago. There's a police sergeant who was able for years to shake down people who he thought no one would care about, where he would plant drugs and plant guns And these people were talking for years about what was happening. And no one believed them because they were poor people living in poor neighborhoods. That man went to prison, went to federal prison for shaking people down. And for years, no one did anything about the men and women that he sent to prison. I'm very proud of the fact that as a prosecutor, I felt it was my obligation to not know of the harm that had been inflicted and not lead the effort to fix it. And so back in 2017, we started with the first mass exoneration in Cook County, exonerating 15 men for crimes that they didn't commit at the hands of this corrupt officer. I'm proud to say that in less than a year's time, there have been 50 men who have had their cases exonerated. And it's not just about those men. Quite frankly, it's about the greater good. For the rest of the people who live in our city who can believe that there's some measure of justice that can happen when people believe and listen to those, particularly those who many have been ignored. What does this mean for all of you? It means that we need an activated force to say that we don't accept failed systems as an excuse for us to engage in policies and practices in our criminal justice system. That we can reimagine what it's like to care for those who have been impacted by crime and violence and poverty and inequity in ways that don't involve incarceration. It means that we will be open and transparent. I'm very proud of the fact that my office, second largest prosecutor's office in the country, in dealing with questions about racial disparities, and was our office engaging in practices that was targeting communities of color, that I said, the way that we'll show it is we will put every case that we've touched for the last 7 years on an open data portal. We're the first office in the country to make our data fully transparent. And what I said was, there will be things that are good, there will be things that are bad, and there will be things that are ugly. But it is my obligation as the public servant to every person in Cook County to show them and do better. And so organizations, tech organizations, have been incredibly helpful in getting into the criminal justice space and working on issues like bail reform, on working on issues like data transparency. But it requires an understanding that what we have right now is broken. And so in the interest of the greater good, I remind you once again of the little girl who I started this story with, or of our speaker this morning who talked about his father having been incarcerated, and ask you to imagine for a moment, if we allow our systems to continue the way they are right now, what greatness are we leaving behind? What potential and hope and community that we may have written off could be solving for some of the greatest issues that we face here today? And so my challenge to all of you is to know what's happening in your communities around criminal justice, to know that the stories that you'll hear from Ms. Alice and others, they are not unique. And know that the onus is not on them to solve for this alone, that what is happening to them affects all of our greater good. And I so very much look forward to partnering with you all to make sure that we're living up to the best ideals of the criminal justice system that we have in the United States. Thank you very, very much.